Thank you, folks. So, yeah, UnOAuthorized, it's a bit of a mouthful. And we'll just jump right into things here. As mentioned, I'm Eric Woodruff. Spent 24-something years on the blue side of things and maybe 6-7 months pretending to be a red person. So I don't have any sort of, fancy hacker name, but hopefully Eric and identity is, sort of easy enough to remember. You want to reach out to me. And also beyond just, trying to entertain, hundreds of people, my wife traveled over to Italy with me, and she's a creative director. So I also have to make sure that, the design and hopefully the slides don't suck, right? Because she'll criticize me after the talk as well. So as far as the name UnOauthorized goes, right, we take unauthorized, and if we take OAuth 2.0, right, which is a sort of modern way for authorization to occur out there on, the cloud and SaaS apps and all that sort of stuff, right? That's where unauthorized comes from. And again, no help from AI or marketing or anyone with the name. I like names for bugs and things, so I was proud of myself. So we'll kind of jump into the background of things and then progress deeper into some knowledge around multi-tenant applications in Entra, and then look at the findings and whatnot here. So right with the background itself, there's been a lot of research on applications and service principles within Entra, which was formerly Azure AD, for pretty much as long as it's existed. And a lot of other researchers out there, probably some of these you may know, in particular Dirk-Jan Malema, hey, butchered his name there, right, has done a lot of research 2019 on service principles and applications relative to Microsoft apps, and found at the time there was like 100-something applications out there that you could essentially assign credentials to and impersonate. And actually at that time I was working at Microsoft running Azure Active Directory assessments for enterprise customers. I was in services, and in doing that, we had an indicator that at the time looked for credentials assigned to Microsoft applications, and it was hard even within Microsoft to try to understand or find an answer internally as to why we're looking for this thing in customer environments. And it always kind of stuck in my head, but again, being a blue person, working sort of in consulting light, like I didn't really care, I just sort of stashed away in my mind. But up until more recently, for the past couple of years, I've been at Semperis where, focused on like Active Directory and Entra security, trying to apply a lot of that sort of blue knowledge I've built up from, customer behavior and what things look like in the cloud, and, trying to see if there's some interesting stuff out there. Right, and when we're talking about the cloud, again, right, if we want to own the cloud, if you're more familiar with something like domain admin, right, a global admin essentially is the keys to the kingdom out there, right? If you get global admin, you get basically whatever you want, whether it's in Azure, Microsoft 365, you've got, SaaS applications federated, right? So global admin ownership is pretty severe. You can even pivot right back into Active Directory if, you're running domain controllers out in the cloud. So, the severity of getting global admin is something to not be taken lightly. So, also want to talk about the application administrator role, right? And this role is something that you needed to hold or a similar role in order to be able to actually perform the finding here, right? And so, just kind of exploring the application administrator role, right? We have our Entra ID tenant here, right? And then we have either application administrator or cloud application administrator, but because all this stuff is a mouthful, right, both roles essentially are impacted, but we'll just refer to them both as application administrator. Right, and so we assigned this role to, a user, and it's common to see in enterprises this role being used, right, and then it's basically for the lifecycle management, again, of those SaaS applications, right, so your Salesforces, if you're multi-cloud, right, AWS, GCP, all this stuff that you may be trying to tie back to Entra, right, for authentication, authorization, all that good stuff. But again, enterprises can have 500,000 plus SaaS applications, so the role's pretty commonly used. But if we take other roles, right, like global admin, again, that keys the kingdom, and we go try to, manage roles, right, we're not allowed to do that, right? And roles, in their simple definition, right, it's sort of like the do's and don'ts, right? You have these swim lanes just stick in, and so an app admin is not allowed to manage roles in Entra in a greenfield tenant. And also, if you've been around the block for a while, right, you may be familiar with this. It's services control panel within Windows. Love it or hate Windows, right? As a consumer of Windows, if you're using Windows, you don't necessarily care about the applications under the hood. The service is running just as long as they're there, right? And running and doing what they're supposed to. You consume Windows. And the cloud, right, a Microsoft estate is very similar. And there's some services that exist out there, right, that may look familiar, like Azure Key Vault and the Azure portal and things like that, and Exchange Online and SharePoint Online. But there's actually hundreds and hundreds of other Microsoft services that run in an estate. I've seen organizations that have had up to 800-900 Microsoft applications, service principals in their estate out there, right? So there's a lot of stuff that, again, we don't really know or care about, right? It just is there as we're consuming Microsoft stuff. And so I'm going to jump a bit deeper into applications because the sort of, grasp the finding and also to not make it a 3-minute talk, right? Figure that we'll talk about multi-tenant applications and how they work because this is sort of pivotal and critical to understand the finding and the vulnerabilities here. So, right, we'll play pretend for a second. So, right, I'm a software developer, I'm a publisher, and I have a Entra tenant that I use, right, for other organizations that want to consume whatever the software is I'm making. And so within my tenant, I create this thing called an app registration, and I give it some name, whatever it is, and it's going to have this client ID that's globally unique across all Entra tenants. If you're consuming this app, you can reference this client ID. And then there's going to be permissions in here. And again, right, as a dev, I'm basically saying these permissions are the things I need for whatever it is my application is to do, right? So here we have user read write all, directory read write all, and group read all. And then I assign credentials to it, right? So this can either be a secret, which is effectively just a password for an application, or we can use asymmetric keys, right? So certificates or whatnot for authentication within Entra. Right, and then I go build my actual application. So the application, it doesn't matter if it's running in, Azure, AWS, on-prem, Kubernetes, right? You have that application, and there's a relationship here because that app has the client ID. It's also going to have your tenant ID and essentially these credentials, right? And now it's able to, authenticate to Entra. But I need customers, or right, I'm going out of business pretty quick here. So, right, generally speaking, a customer comes along, and a global admin will show up at the door, and they go to the application, and sort of high level here, they'll perform what's called an admin consent or an admin consent grant. And when they do this, they're basically creating this service principal on their tenant, right? So a service principal is a security principal. So if you think of like users and sometimes groups, right, there's security principles that you can assign roles, you can assign permissions to these things, right? And when we create this, we're also effectively, we'll see this represented with some application name again. And in particular, we're agreeing to allow these permissions, right? So the developer's like, hey, I need these permissions for my thing to work. And we're like, yep, give us these permissions. Or we'll allow these permissions in our tenant for whatever your app is. Right, and so we essentially have this relationship here between this app registration and the service principal. And there is a many-to-one relationship. So if I have 100 customers, each tenant's going to have its own service principal, so there'll be 100 service principals all tied back to my app registration, right? And again, as the developer, I kind of manage the life cycle of this thing because I'm, dictating what the software does. But this in itself doesn't do anything, right? We need APIs, we need things to go do stuff against. And so generally when we're talking about identity out in, the Microsoft world, we're looking at Graph API. Right, and effectively what we can do is we can go authenticate to the customer's tenant. And as long as that's successful, right, we're using that credential we have, we'll get an access token back. And we can then pass that access token for authorization to Graph API under the context of that customer's tenant, and right, go be able to do the stuff as we've have defined in our service principal. So if we start to look at Microsoft applications, right, these function in very similar ways. They have a little bit of, secret special sauce to them, right? And as consumers of Microsoft stuff, we don't get to really see under the hood. So we sometimes have to sort of make educated guesses as to how some of this functions. But, in Microsoft applications, they have their Microsoft tenant. And they have app registrations, right? So there's app registrations for Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and again, we all have all these hundreds and hundreds of service principals that exist in our consuming tenant. And so in this example, we have device registration service, as just I picked as a Microsoft service here to represent, right? And so if this wants to go do things against Graph API, right, again, it's going to go authenticate against our tenant. It's going to get an access token back. And then again, device registration service can pass that access token along to Graph. And again, go do whatever the stuff is, right, that is defined within the app registration as far as its permissions go. Now, I will say also there's a lot of other APIs, both documented and undocumented by Microsoft out there. But sort of for the focus of the research here, it's really on Graph API and not other Microsoft APIs that exist. Right, so this pivots into the research, right, which is really looking to impersonate Microsoft applications. And right, when I'm saying impersonate, what we're actually looking to do is act as Microsoft service principals for multi-tenant applications, right? Again, another mouthful, but essentially, right, we're looking to borrow their identity. We're looking to impersonate these applications, right? So from a Entra perspective, from a Graph perspective, it thinks that we're, whatever the Microsoft service is. Right, so, and this is where it gets interesting because while we have that credential on the app registration, right, that Microsoft owns and manages, we also can assign a credential to service principals, right? And so now this is a credential I know, right, and Microsoft doesn't know it. I mean, they store it, but they don't, well, hopefully know what it is, right? But I have this credential, so I can bring along some impersonating application and like I'm lazy, so I was just using Graph PowerShell SDK and Azure AD PowerShell modules, right? So I take my PowerShell, right, and I take that client ID, I take my tenant ID, and I take those credentials, right? And then again, I can, right, we have Graph API show up, authenticate to my tenant, right? As long as that works, get an access token back. And then again, pass that access token off to Graph API, right? Again, be able to do the same stuff that device registration services is supposed to do via Graph. Now, getting a bit more into the weeds, this only works in an OAuth 2 client credential grant flow. And so when you start to get into some of these, exploring some of these ways of authenticating and authorizing yourself into, Entra and Graph and all this sort of stuff, right? It requires a bit of fundamental knowledge of different OAuth flows. But the focus here is the client credential grant flow, which I shortcut to CCGF just to try to make things, fit on the screen here in a few places. Right, and so this may feel like a recap, but if we look at the OAuth 2 client credential grant flow, right, effectively in this flow against Entra, right, we request an access token from Entra ID with the client ID and the credential, right, as we just sort of looked at, right, as long as that credential is valid, we'll get an access token back. We pass that access token along to Graph, right? Graph will validate that access token, and then Microsoft returns the requested data, right? And this is a REST API, so right, we're performing GETs if we want to read data. And more interestingly, in line with the research, was either post update things or post or putting new data out there or patching data. Usually is how we update things out within Graph or Microsoft Graph. But a few things to note here, right, with the client credential grant flow, right, this .default scope is the only scope permitted by Microsoft Graph. And you may say, like, well, what the hell is, the default scope, right? So a default scope are the application permissions defined in the app registration. So within the OAuth, like, RFC, right, scopes are effectively permissions. And in Microsoft Docs, you'll see scope and permissions used interchangeably. So if you see either, you can essentially think of them as the same thing. But the default scope does not indicate additional permissions provided by other authorization systems, and this could be potentially considered foreshadowing. Right, so this is like great. We sort of have our theory here, but we need to actually find applications that support, the OAuth 2 client credential grant flow here. And so essentially, just kind of walking through the rather simple bits of code here, right? So this PowerShell snippet using get Azure AD service principal, which is actually from the Azure AD graph PowerShell modules, right? We can actually look for an attribute on service principals that has the owner tenant ID, right? And this is Microsoft's sort of universal tenant ID. So we can easily get all applications that are effectively Microsoft apps. And then we're just going to run this through a for each where we're assigning a new service principal password credential here, right? And unlike with users where we can sort of dictate what a password might be, right? With service principals, we're just given something that's generated by Microsoft on the back end. So we dump this essentially out to a CSV so that we can operate with these later. And we're looking at using password credentials. Also tested this with certificates, right? Asymmetric key pairs. And the findings are mostly similar for the applications that supported these flows. Right, so again, we go through this process, and like I was saying, right, there's hundreds of applications. So here we have 573 applications or service principals, right, in just this one test tenant I have. But right, this in itself doesn't really mean much of anything because I've just assigned credentials to it. Right, so now we actually have to see, well, what supports that client credential grant flow. So, but again, we're going to take our service principals and we're just sort of running them through a for each here again, right? And we're just going to stuff the credentials into a PowerShell credential object here, right? Essentially the client ID and the secret. Right now we're just going to connect to Microsoft Graph, but this time again we're connecting to our tenant, right? The tenant that we're interested in looking at, not the Microsoft tenant. And then we run this get mg context command, and again at first I'm just like, well, I'll just dump this out to a text file because I don't really know what the results are going to look like if I'm going to have 500 apps or one app or whatnot, and just sort of loop through this. So the findings were that there's 9 applications that support the OAuth 2 client credential grant flow. And this list actually isn't that much of a secret in a way in the identity world. Going back to Dirk-Jan, his research in 2019, right, where he had like 100-something applications, and Microsoft whittled that list down quite a bit after some stuff he reported to MSRC. And there's been a few iterations of this where, right, things happen, things are found, reports are made to MSRC, and this list kind of continues to go down, right? But again, I was interested in being able to, right, sort of, escalate privilege or move laterally or something that felt a bit juicy here, right? So was really interested in looking for right scopes or right permissions, right? And so of these 9 applications, right, 4 of these found there were some right scopes out there, but even if you look at the names of these, and if you're familiar with Microsoft's identity world in Entra or Azure AD, they're not actually that juicy, right? We also find that there's one application where it had a few read scopes but no write scopes, and then these last 4 that had no scopes at all, right? So, device registration, Azure multi-factor auth client, Skype for Business, and AAD password protection proxy. Like essentially with any of those, if I go through the flow, right, I can authenticate and get an access token, but I shouldn't be able to do anything. I should get a 403 unauthorized here. Right, and this is where I said, well, like, let's try privileged things. Anyways, so, it's one of those things where you just sort of have a feeling, right? And this is where a lot of other research kind of has ended off previously because people looked at that list and they're like, yep, like there's still not much of anything good looking in this. So, I guess case is closed. But, taking sort of the knowledge right around, well, how can we, own things or right, do privileged things in Entra was looking at, well, like let's look at disabling a regular or privileged user, right? Let's try changing a user or privileged user's password, managing role assignments in Entra, creating users, deleting a user, trying to delete a privileged user, permanently deleting privileged users because by default users are soft deleted for an easy restore, creating groups eligible for role assignment, right? Because we can assign roles to groups and not just users. Creating administrative units, which are right sort of a logical bucket for things that maybe, again, if we create an administrative unit, maybe we could put things in it and then try to exert control over them. And then also manage role assigned group membership, right? So maybe there's a group that already is assigned roles, right? Maybe we can sort of fiddle with this stuff. So as far as the results go, right? And so if we look at right, this diagram had up earlier where effectively we weren't able to do anything right as an application administrator as far as managing roles go, we'll kind of walk through the most critical finding here, right? So unfortunately, Microsoft did fix this relatively quick after I reported it. I was hoping to record, a video or something like that, but all I ended up with were some screenshots, unfortunately. So we'll walk through these things. So, but again, just kind of starting from that beginning part, right? We have our target service principal, and we're running that get Azure AD service principal, and we're targeting device registration service, right? It's one of those 9 apps that we can perform the flow against here. Right, and then we're, again, taking those creds and just stuffing them into a PowerShell credential object, and, right, well, we're creating the credentials first, right, up here, and then we're stuffing them into a PowerShell cred object, and right now we're connecting to Microsoft Graph, again, against our tenant. Right, and so once we connect, this is that get mg context command, right, that effectively is supposed to tell us like things about our graph session here, and right, and so in particular, if we look at the app name, we can see that we're a device registration service as far as graph is concerned. And more importantly, we don't have any scopes, like we shouldn't be able to do anything again while we're connected here. But actually did find that we could run some various read out, or we could perform some various read calls to graph, right? So ran get mg directory role, and right, some of these things we could do out of band where we didn't have to be device registration service, right? If I'm an application administrator, I'd already have rights to make some of these calls. But just as a bit of an identity nerd here, I was like, well, let me try these things as device registration services anyways, right? And again, found that we can enumerate all the directory roles, right? And our target is global administrator here, and we can run get mg directory role member, right, and find that there's currently 2 global administrators in this tenant, me and my alter personality, me here. Right, so we're able to enumerate those roles, and now we're like, well, we can also look up users in the tenant. So our target here is just Megan Bowen, right? That we're going to try to make her a global admin here, and we're really just interested primarily in her object ID. Because what we're going to do is we're going to just basically splat into an array here, the role definition ID, which represents global administrator, the principal ID, which is actually Megan's object ID, because Microsoft can't just sort of be consistent with naming things, and then the directory scope ID, which is root, because you can't have a global admin that's not sort of at the root of a tenant here. Right, so we have our little array, and then the big test here is right running through this new MG role management directory role assignment, where we're essentially trying to make Megan a global admin, right? And there isn't a 403 response, right? We actually get data back, and at first I'm like, well, that's odd, right? And sometimes test tenants, test environments, it can be a dump, and like, you don't know what the hell you've done on the thing. So, go through like a few more tenants here, and right, every time I run this, I'm like, well, let's run get mg context again, and yep, we're still device registration service, and we still have no scopes here, right? But if we go then, out back to PowerShell and run that get mg directory role member again, right here, we can actually now see that Megan is in fact now a global admin, right? So as an application administrator, I now have the ability to basically manage any role in a Entra tenant, right? Global admin again sort of being the pinnacle of what we're trying to get. Right, and we could actually see this again if we go in our Entra audit logs here, right, and see again add member to role is successful for global administrator, right, as device registration service. And this was an audit log sample from a different tenant that I was testing with. So we're just kind of walking through this flow a bit more visually here, right, where we have the inability to manage roles, right? Essentially, we go out to device registration service, we assign that credential, right? We take PowerShell, or we could make direct graph calls, right? It doesn't matter. PowerShell's just lazy me, right? We go out to it with that client ID and that credential, and then we're actually off to manage, roles in Entra here. And also, interestingly, we could remove role membership, right? So we could remove MG role management, directory role assignment, which are already sort of, ran a few other commands to get the unified role assignment I was interested in, right? But then find that then we run get mg directory role member, and we could actually remove another global admin. And it's not specific to this finding, but actually if you have certain permissions, you can actually drain all the global admins in a tenant and actually have 0, which even a lot of folks at Microsoft believe that is not possible, right? So with the findings, the most critical here was device registration service, right? Being able to manage any role, but also found that Viva Engage, which is known as Yammer for the 2 people that might use it, right? That this service principal, we could actually delete and permanently delete privileged users within the tenant as well, again, including global admins. And if we assigned a credential to a rights management service, that we could actually create users in the tenant. Right, so the Microsoft response to this. So I opened a case at the beginning of January, and initially, the couple weeks later, they actually came back to me and told me this is low severity. So I'm like, okay, well, let me paint out a bunch of attack paths for you, and we'll see what you think. And then in their sort of Microsoft ways, I don't hear anything for another month and a half, and then all of a sudden, I get an email that the device registration service was now important severity for privilege elevation, but it was resolved. But along with this, right, so I think it's end of March, beginning of April, right, still had Viva Engage sort of lingering here, where they came back and they said this was medium severity and resolved. And rights management service, they flagged as low severity, and again, it was resolved. And now, to me, again, as a bit of an identity nerd, right, we have these lanes that we're supposed to be in, again, where we're allowed or not allowed to do certain things. Right, I tried arguing with MSRC that I think from a severity perspective, right, if we're talking about authorization, which should be absolute, if we're able to do anything that we're not allowed to do, that should be a pretty big deal in their world, right? But after a few, sort of back and forth with Microsoft, you kind of lose steam and, you just move on. But one of the questions I had for them, right, is well, why did this work, right? Why did device registration service have the ability to manage roles, and why don't I see anything right from a graph perspective as far as scopes or permissions, right? And so again, if we're sort of abstracting a bit, because this is where Microsoft isn't really forthcoming in this area, right? But if we have our Microsoft application and we have Microsoft Graph, and right on our target here we have Entra ID, right? There's multiple authorization systems at play. Now, as a third party, right, there's only 2 authorization systems that we really primarily use when we're talking about Graph, right? It's either our OAuth scopes, our permissions, or the one sort of alternative is roles, right? Role assignments are one of the few things where, right, if you have a role, right, you don't necessarily need a scope. But both of these things would be visible within our JSON web token, right? But again, I unfortunately don't have it to show here, but in inspecting the JA, looked at the WIDs, there's no roles assigned there, right? And again, looking at the scopes within it, there's nothing there, right? Because it was asked a question well, maybe they're just sort of, obfuscating things, and it's in the JA, it's just not showing up, right, within some of their tooling. But the thing is that Microsoft said that there are other authorization models, right? And this is where they point me to, Azure RM and, the Exchange Online PowerShell, or not Exchange Online PowerShell, but right, there's roles within Exchange Online. But if you really start to dig into them, right, it kind of doesn't really make any sense as far as Entra goes and, the findings here, right? But effectively, they said, right, that's why even though there's no OAuth scopes, right, that on the back end, there's this other authorization system that is what allowed these, commands to right, take place and not receive a 403 error. And I'm still trying to press them a bit to be a bit more forthcoming about what these other authorization systems are, because I don't have a lot right now that I can really talk about, but again, just in inspecting things, where they're trying to point you, it feels just like it's a bit of a wild goose chase that they're sending you on. And also, when we look at this list of applications that support OAuth 2 client credential grant flow, it's actually now applications that supported, right, OAuth 2 client credential grant flow. So again, right, the pruning of this list, they've spent a good amount of time iterating through this, which is actually, some of this is why, while much of this was resolved back in, March, April timeframe, there were some other things that kind of held up really being able to talk about this until the summer. Right, but now if we run that connect MG graph again, right, and here we're trying to connect this device registration service, where earlier we'd be able to connect. We get this super cryptic error message from Microsoft, which again, they're not great with error messages, where this is telling us that we might have our client ID and our secret transposed, but actually in talking with them, they're saying this is effectively a mechanism that they have for their first-party applications to block the ability to hand out access tokens for things like device registration service. So, talking about the defense of this, right? I mean, it's a Microsoft sort of problem with a Microsoft resolution. Right, sort of just working on the blue side, well, it's a bit like you don't know if this was really abused out in the wild, but, I am concerned, right, because the findings permitted highly privileged operations. And also there's a strong probability that this has existed for a long time, right? Again, going back 10, 15 something years, because when I ask Microsoft how long do they think this has existed, and then I say I think it has existed for 10 plus years, and they don't say anything, right? I take their sort of silence as an answer there, right? Device registration service has been around for as long as joining devices to Azure AD has been. But we can look for some markers in Entra tenants, right? So going a little blue here, right? Because if we, and my concern around this is, again, sort of going back to this diagram in particular, that for a lot of organizations, right, fancy animation where the crown falls off the application administrator role here is, a lot of orgs don't treat app administrator as tier 0, they treat it as tier 1 or no tier at all, right? So the protections around this user usually are pretty weak at a lot of enterprises, right? So if, Mr. or Mrs. Threat Actor shows up, right, and compromises that application or cloud app admin, right, they can run through this same sort of thing we did and become a global admin, right? And again, very sort of scary graphic here, right, where it's off to the races as far as what they could do. Now, obviously, like an attacker likely isn't going to just hang on to global admin, but there's a lot of stuff around service principles, right, if we look at things like Midnight Blizzard, where right, threat actors have interesting ways of getting into tenants, in particular with service principles and applications that most enterprises are really not mature enough to sort of even defend against or really understand what's even going on here. So right, as far as looking for suspicious credentials, again, because the client ID is globally unique, we can actually just run get mg service principal and filter on that client ID, which is also again app ID here within Graph SDK PowerShell, and look for key credentials, right? So we're looking for any certificates that might be assigned to device registration service, and we can run the same command for password credentials here, right? Where we're looking to see if there's any secrets assigned to these, right? And this is where if there was a finding of these in a tenant, it should be considered concerning because there's no valid reason to have this stuff there. Again, right, you could also take your favorite SIM or SIEM, and this is where, right, hunting for this stuff is going to fall apart because a lot of orgs, I can't think of a single org, right, that's going to keep 10-something years worth of audit logs in Entra, right? But for giggles, right, again, we can go out and run a simple KQL query, or again, in whatever SIEM you're dumping stuff to here, and right, look for suspicious credentials being assigned to like device registration service. And we can also look for suspicious actions, right? Because if we go look at our audit logs, again, we saw earlier that we have the ability to sort of query, right, for things that device registration service has done. And in particular, if we see it managing roles, well, that's a bit of a problem. Right, so a lot of the details and some of these things, right, where it may be hard to read, actually have out on this blog article here. So you can go to sl.entra.ms/unauthorized, and it's all documented out there. And I throw out at every talk that I use this domain a lot for short links, and if anyone from Microsoft wants to buy it, it is for sale. Right, but so, initially when I gave this talk at Black Hat, or a sort of variant of it, one of the things that was posed to me as the biggest question sort of after this was, right, can this finding impact non-Microsoft applications, right? Because if you're not an identity person, it could feel hard to sort of, walk through this journey with me here, right? And the answer is no, right? Because again, if we go back to this diagram here, right, only Microsoft really knew or could use, right? They only knew about and they were the only ones that could really use these other authorization models, right? Because they're not exposed to us. We have no way of sort of saying, like, yes, we want to use this hidden auth model. But, the follow-up there, and again, the blue person in me would warn folks, right, like around can organizations create scenarios that mimic these findings, right? And the answer here is yes. And again, this isn't really like mind-blowing new research in this area, but it's a thing that seems to come up sort of, every year when there's something going on with, applications or service principals and tenants. So, right, figure it's always a good time to kind of talk about this again, right? Because those OAuth scopes and roles for third-party applications, right, are something that can be abused. They are abused in the wild by threat actors, and they're an area where, again, right, organizations can pull out the foot gun and easily shoot themselves a couple of times in the foot here, right? And so in particular, we're talking about risky application permissions, role management read-write directory, and app role assignment read-write all. And so if we look at role management read-write directory, right, the Microsoft Docs definition of this here is, right, allows the app to read and manage the role-based access control settings for the company directory without assigning a user, right? So it's acting as the application, right? So instantiating directory roles, managing role membership, reading role templates, right? Basically saying if you have this app permission, you can do whatever you want with roles, right? So we have our application that has role management read-write directory, right? And the concern here that is this is, again, able to, right, add or remove people to any role, including global admin. So if, like, Tom in accounting owns this application and Tom in accounting becomes, targeted or, right, he's an insider threat, Tom in accounting is also effectively now a global administrator if he has the ability to manage this privileged application. And really just one step away is app role assignment read-write all, right? And this allows the app to manage permission grants for application permissions to any API, including Microsoft Graph, without assigned end users. So earlier when we're looking at that flow where we have the admin consent grant, and, right, some privileged user, human, right, has to come along and approve these consents. If you have app role assignment read-write all, it's one way you can bypass that, right? So again, if we have our service principal here, right, and it has app role assignment read-write all assigned to it, well, that itself doesn't allow it to manage roles, right, either onto itself or any other service principal in the tenant, right? We may be able to assign role management read-write directory, right? And then at that point, we're off to managing roles again, right? So whatever this application may be, if it has app role assignment read-write all, whoever the user is that owns this or holds any privilege over this, like an application admin or a cloud app admin, is also effectively a global administrator. So there's also this app instance property lock setting that Microsoft has had out now for a couple years, but we're really just starting to see more uptake around it. And so app instance property lock, right, if we go look at this sort of flow here where we could assign that credential to the service principal, right, the little yellow key there, if we enable app instance property lock, well, actually, right, that flow would then allow us to walk through these things that we were looking at here. But if we have our SaaS application and we actually have app instance property lock on for credentials, when we actually go out there and try to add a credential to the service principal, we're going to be blocked, right? And so if we actually go out into like the Entra portal, again, we could set this through, Graph or PowerShell or whatnot, right? But if we're looking in the Entra portal and we actually go under the authentication settings for an app registration as the sort of developer of this, we can go down to the app instance property lock settings. And if we have credentials locked, right, then when someone goes and tries to assign creds onto a service principal, they're going to get yet another cryptic error from Graph, but effectively what this is saying is that you're not allowed to, right, assign credentials. And this is effectively what Microsoft is implementing on things like device registration service, but they don't actually eat their own dog food. In this area, they have something that's like similar but different, but it achieves that same end goal. Right, and also just there, from a defense perspective would say here, right, also potentially look at workloads identity premium. Now, this is like a thing that causes an upstir because it's a add-on from a cost perspective. But right, if we have 3 applications that are highly privileged, then we only need to essentially go buy 3 instances of workload identity premium. So right, it's not as awful as waiting for Microsoft 365 E7 to come out or whatnot, right? So if we have our Entra tenant, right, effectively what Workloads Identity Premium can allow us to do, right, is apply conditional access and identity protection to this, right? So from a conditional access perspective, right now we can only apply location evaluation, right? But if we have a trusted network and we have that third-party application or some line of business application, right, running, we can actually have this trusted network, right, that we've defined, right? And so when it goes to auth and do its things, right, to get its access token, right, it will go into conditional access and it will evaluate and say, yep, like you're coming from that trusted network. And then if the unknown network shows up, right, because we've stolen the secrets or they're stored in GitHub or whatnot, right, and we have those creds and go to auth to Entra, right, we'll actually get denied, potentially as long as we have our conditional access configured properly here. And at the same time, right, identity protection, I think they have room to go here with this because a lot of this is an offline detection, so right, it's not going to be immediate. But with identity protection, we have things where it's going to effectively look at like risk detection, right? So say we also, or not we, but Microsoft has found, right, as they're going through, GitHub, essentially secrets stored in repos, and right, they find matching secrets for your application, right, they can also effectively block that through identity protection, right? So now even if it's coming from a trusted network, right, but the secret has been leaked or found somewhere, and there's some other detections as well, right, we'll actually block auth there, right, because it's considered risky. Right, so from a recap perspective, like, because initially this was like this finding around global admin, but moving into and talking about third-party, SaaS applications or line of business apps here, right? Really still trying to press Microsoft to get an answer here, right? Because from an authorization perspective, it's like, well, hard to understand or tell what's providing auth Z here. And this is where we really need transparency from Microsoft, right? Because it starts to give this who's watching the watcher sort of feeling, right, where trust is eroded, right? If they have some other auth Z system and they're not telling us what it is, right, well, how do we know or trust what else exists or is used out there from an authentication or authorization perspective? And we can also, again, like we were looking at earlier, right, check your tenant for credentials. It's easy, but it's not an absolute guarantee that we're going to find anything. Right, and again, the takeaway here around third-party and business privileged applications, right, and business being those line of business apps, is that they really need to be defended and protected against because this is a thing that attackers are turning to. And I didn't get a chance to read it, but just I think yesterday, right, Microsoft published some new news out there about how they're seeing more hybrid attacks with attackers going after cloud. And service principals and apps are absolutely where the attackers are going to be. And that is it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. So we have a couple of questions for you. So the first one is, do you think it's possible that a malware could use those services permission to install like a backdoor? Would this hypothetical code need no admin permission?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So to be clear, these permissions, and I think it's confusing because it like uses device registration service, right? This is really abusing permissions into Entra. Now, I mean, I would think off the top of my head, in theory, if you're a global admin, you could become an Intune admin, and if you're an Intune admin, or you don't need to become an Intune admin, you are a global or Intune admin, but you would have some path to devices. I think that path would be very long, and realistically, I don't foresee someone necessarily using that because it's really trying to abuse that relationship between applications and the identity provider to do other identity things out there for more like an identity persistence. So.
And number one is, do you think switching from a role-based to an attribute-based access control would be more effective and secure in dealing access to resources despite multiple authentication models?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I probably could stand here and ponder RBAC versus ABAC, and then you get into policy-based access control, and right. I mean, I think definitely like the role-based access control in Entra, Microsoft 365 in particular, is weak, right? There's a lot more role granularity out there in Azure. You know, from an attribute-based perspective, though, it gets tough because, but if you start talking about bringing in some other IDP, right, as far as, you know, well, it's a good question, but I think I could stand here and easily ponder it. You know, if we're talking about attributes, though, I guess from a dynamic group perspective, right, then though dynamic groups are something that we cannot assign to roles out in Entra. So we're actually limited sort of in the Microsoft ecosystem from really being able to, I guess I'd say, easily use attributes for, you know, access to things. And again, it depends on what those are. So, you know, I consulted. It's like a non-answer. It depends, so.
Okay, no, that's it. Thanks,
All right,
thanks
thank
a
you.
lot, Eric. Thanks again.